This year in Davos at the World Economic Forum, the global elite seemed in vertigo, group dizziness, and in collective denial, networking deals and dining on caviar and champagne while lamenting the problems of the poor. Some say that globalization is more important than ever. Others say that Davos was like the nostalgic reunion of an aging rock band. Globalization has lost its way and its steam. Witness President Trump, Brexit, nationalism everywhere. The Davos star certainly was China's President Xi Jinping, with his ringing call for renewed globalization. But why is China now promoting globalization so vigorously? What are the implications as China becomes the new champion of an open world? But how open is China itself? Globalization and its challenges takes us closer to China.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So said Xi Jinping, the first Chinese president to address the World Economic Forum in Davos, quoting Charles Dickens, in his robust defense and high-minded vision of economic globalization. The timing, as it turned out, was propitious, as the United States, the world's largest developed country, has begun to look inward.
To be only America first.
And as regional conflicts, refugees, terrorism, and continuing poverty increase global uncertainties, China's president was the bulwark of rational sensibilities, the cosmopolitan headliner for the annual gathering of the world's business and political elites.
There is no point in blaming economic globalization for the world's problems, as it is simply not the case, and will not help solve the problems.
President Xi stressed the need to develop a dynamic, innovation-driven growth model, featuring open markets and win-win cooperation. And he stressed that China's growth is an opportunity for the world, not a threat. China's development facilitates world development.
We should develop a dynamic, innovation-driven growth model. The fundamental problem plaguing the global economy is the lack of a driving force for growth. Innovation is the primary force guiding development. We need to relentlessly pursue innovation. Only with the courage to innovate and reform can we remove the bottlenecks blocking global growth and development.
Xi's address was welcomed warmly by the elite attendees, who have been reeling from increasing anti-globalization, protectionism, and nationalism in the US, the UK, and Europe. The irony that it is the leader of a communist country who has become the champion of an open global market system was not lost on the sophisticated crowd.
The most important thing is the commitment of the president and the commitment of China to be part of the world, to be part of the global economy, and to be open to products from all over the world. I think that's the most important thing, and that is the announcement that makes impact in the global economy.
I think it was a very opportune and very timely with what's going on around us. And I think he was very good in terms of talking about the trade, open trade. Matter of fact, in a very good way, answering what Trump and the Brexiteers and other populists talking about in terms of being protectionist and closing the door. So I think the world, you cannot close, the world is open. It's one small little village now.
We're in a period in the world right now where many countries are becoming more nationalistic. They're worried about globalization. And he was a very strong advocate for globalization and to keep moving in that direction. He talked about no one benefits from a trade war. I thought that was really good that he touched on that. No one benefits from a currency war. So we need to work through these issues together and recognize that globalization is not our enemy.
Well, it was a very encouraging speech in the sense that clearly his view is that we should not blame all the world's problems on globalization, that yes, there are challenges with globalization, but there are also huge benefits. China has benefited, China has participated, and he very clearly articulated a view and some specific policies where China would like to help further globalization in terms of opening up its markets for more imports, opening up its market for more foreign direct investment, making sure that its exchange rate policy is not destabilizing. So I think these were very reassuring words for a lot of people.
The weekly publication, The Economist, went further and called President Xi Jinping the new Davos man, which brings up questions. Will the Davos ideal bend towards China? And does China even want to be a global leader?
I'm pleased to discuss globalization and its challenges with two of China's thought leaders. Professor Zhang Weiwei is the director of the Center for China Development Model Research at Fudan University and director of the Institute of China Studies, Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, and Dr. Teng Jianchun, director of the Department for American Studies at China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. Has globalization been turned on its head? Here we have China as a developing country promoting globalization, whereas countries, US and UK in particular, which are advanced economies with high technology and developed economies that normally promote globalization, they're now turning inward. How do we understand this? What way of thinking has the world been turned upside down? Professor Zhang, how do we begin to visualize this?
No, actually, from the Chinese point of view, the Western countries are the main beneficiaries of the globalization, but this answer is not enough. More precisely, the multinationals of these companies, these countries are beneficiaries, but the peoples of these countries are not yet. So this is the problem why this country become increasingly anti-globalization. And China, to a great extent, thanks to China model, has made best use of globalization, and China has become a major beneficiary of globalization, and China embraced globalization. So this is the case now. Yeah.
So, Dr. Teng, isn't, by the fact that China has more at stake in globalization today than virtually any other country, does that make China more vulnerable, and therefore with the retreat of the US and the UK and other countries potentially from globalization, is that kind of forcing China to take the lead? I mean, China, like, it doesn't want to do it, but it has no choice because it's so dependent on globalization. Is that a fair way to read what's happening? Dr. Teng.
Yeah, there has been debate whether China should be a leader in the globalization world economy. The answer, to some extent, is no. I don't think China can play a leading role in this regard. As we all know, globalization of world economy actually is a double-edged sword. On one side, China has benefited greatly from the globalization since it's opened up the reform and since it entered the WTO. And without such arrangement, I don't think China would achieve the achievements in recent years. For example, the normalization of relation with the United States, with Japan, which gave a precondition for the domestic development in China. On the other side, China has contributed greatly to the globalization of the world for the cheap labor, the cheap natural resources, and also China sacrificed a lot in its environment. So this is actually a double-edged sword for any country. China, to some extent, would like to push forward such momentum to globalization, and also China will be very careful in treating the development in some countries. For example, in the United States, in UK, this is actually anti-globalization. How can China have a very balanced policy toward the globalization and anti-globalization at this moment?
If I were to be simplistic, I would say that the anti-globalization movement edifice is founded on two big pillars. One, as Professor Zhang just said, is that the benefits of globalization, although they may be to developing countries, they are to a very small sector of those countries, particularly the multinational corporations and the people who own them, which are oftentimes a large number of people through their retirement plans, et cetera. But people sense when they lose jobs that they are not benefiting. So one piece is economic. The other piece is a worry about instability. President Xi said it very well in his speech about the ongoing conflict of geopolitical instability, the rise of terrorism, and refugee crisis are the root causes of what he said, what has gone wrong with our world. So when we look at these two pillars, the economic imbalances between where the benefits of globalization have been going and the instability in the world and the threats of terrorism and refugees and all of these things. What does China do in promoting globalization, knowing these two root causes? Professor Zhang.
Yeah, if you look at the speech by Xi Jinping at Davos, he used the word very carefully. When he mentioned the idea of globalization, he used the qualifier economic globalization. So it's not a political globalization, social globalization, or other globalization. So this is the Chinese approach to globalization. In other words, we try to make best use of economic globalization and try to create win-win relationship between China and other countries, between China and the United States. On the other hand, on the issues of terrorism, on the issue of other aspects of associated with globalization, China is very cautious. China adopts a specific measure to deal with these problems, hopefully in cooperation with other countries.
Is it the case that China blames American intervention in the Middle East political history, most notably in Iraq in 2003, that brought about such regional instability? When there are so many intractable disputes in the area, why do I always hear China blaming the U.S. For the instability in the world? Would China like to be responsible for the world's stability and have the U.S. out?
In the older type of globalization, so-called the new liberalism, it's a part of globalization, democratization, privatization. That was a trend, for so many years. Fortunately, China resisted this trend. If you look at the Middle East, the first round of so-called democratization, starting with the Iraqi war, 2003, which ended up in disasters. And then the second round, Arab Spring, started with in 2011. So that again ended up in Arab Winter. So that, make people think twice about globalization. So we may need a new type of globalization. Here, many people think the Chinese approach may make some better sense. That is, we should build globalization on the basis of respect for sovereignty, on cooperation, on win-win cooperation. In this context, we try to promote better trade relations, and we try to promote that stage, this One Belt, One Road initiative. It's a Chinese idea based on what we call the joint consultation, joint building, sharing benefits from such cooperation. So this is really a new initiative. In other words, if you want to join this initiative, it's out of your own interest, not for other interests. And then you join it, so it's mutually beneficial.
When we come back, we're going to dig deeper into China's new role in globalization.
While President Xi promised in Davos to continue China's opening up, the American Chamber of Commerce in China published a survey showing a growing pessimism in the foreign business community, with complaints of increasing Chinese protectionism as well as concerns of a slowing Chinese economy.
We really haven't seen reforms, economic reforms. And so I think that it's good that President Xi is saying these things, and hopefully there will be some action, and hopefully there will be opening of markets, but I don't think we've seen we've seen that yet.
China's foreign ministry spokeswoman CHUNYING reversed the accusations.
I think under the current circumstances, who is sincerely and vigorously promoting the liberalization of trade and investment, and who is engaged in protectionism, I think it is clear to everyone.
In his Davos speech, President Xi strongly supported globalization, but globalization comes in three forms: capital, markets, workforce. China may advocate free capital flow, but the country has very strict rules for its own immigration and refugees, which are workforce, and for domestic markets with various kinds of internal protectionism. So what kind of globalization is in China's best interest, and is that in the best interest of other countries?
Yeah, this idea of free flow of capital, goods, and labor actually is controversial, especially the free flow of labor force. I used to work in Geneva and follow the WTO negotiations closely. This idea of free flow of labor and labor service is deeply controversial. Actually, it's the rich countries which reject that, because poor countries, developing countries, have comparative advantages in labor supply. So this is not the main concern yet in these types of globalization up to now. Eventually, people will discuss this issue. So far, I think we should still promote better trade relations in goods, in capital, in other matters. Yeah.
Dr. Tang, isn't China advocating that other countries should welcome China's outflow of goods and manpower? But is China ready to take in goods and manpower from other countries, so it's reciprocal? And what about China opening its markets to foreign companies? There are a lot of controversies about that.
Yeah, I think actually if you look at the car running in the street of Beijing, you can find almost all the large car companies, not only selling their cars, but also established the factories in China. So I think Chinese market is very open as compared with ROK, with Japan, and even with the United States. So this is actually a new time for us to think about the flows of the capital, of labor, and also even the free market in every aspect. And I think China will continue its open up reform policy, and China will welcome all the investment in China, and also the labor flow in China, I'm sure, will be more free for any country.
Well, let's look at what you said. You look at automobiles. There is a restriction that no foreign company can have more than 50%. You don't find that restriction in other countries. So you see foreign cars, but they're 50% owned by Chinese. So that's a significant limitation. And then there are sectors that are not open to foreign capital, very substantial numbers of sectors in energy and telecommunications, financial services, certainly media. Though the Chinese government talks about globalization, aren't these restrictions effectively a protectionism that China has? And even if you open the market, would the state-owned enterprises that are in these markets be ready to compete with foreign firms? And because they're not, due to the structural matters, isn't that why China must continue to protect these markets? Professor Zhang?
I think, for all major countries, including China, United States, strategic sectors are under some kind of government control. And again, everything exists in relative terms in comparing with other countries. If you look at the Chinese company Huawei, it's encountering all kinds of difficulties in entering U.S. market. In contrast, if U.S. companies like Cisco, like Apple, like other IT companies, they have a huge presence in China. Even in the field of automobile market, even with 50%, don't forget China is the world's largest automobile market. So it's a huge business for foreign companies.
In what you're saying, it is technically correct, but with Huawei, the issue is national security in the one case, whereas in the China market, it is pervasive across all information technology. So it is not quite a parallelism, and that's why people say fairly broadly that isn't China being hypocritical in championing globalization and not practicing itself what it preaches for others. And I'm just going to quote you the incoming Secretary of Commerce in the U.S., Wilbur Ross, who's done business in China, and he supposedly will be the putative leader of China's economic team. And he called China the most protectionist major economy in the world. Dr. Tung, do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I'm not 100% in favor of such argument by Mr. Ross. If you look at the figure, you can find this is only election or campaign remarks by the officials in the U.S. government. And I think the regulations taken by the Chinese government in recent years, I think the main purpose for this is to establish normal and very regular trade relations with any country. So not only it's not a protection of the trade or the economy for the sake of the Chinese, but also for the the order of the business in China. And I'm sure such order will give a lot of benefit for any investment in China from other countries.
Look, I just have to look at some simple statistics. U.S. companies and European companies in China are the biggest China fans. They lobby their governments, do whatever they can. So they are super pro-China, obviously so because they have significant economic benefit to do so. That's their job, to increase their shareholder wealth. So we understand that. So why then, this year, do more than 80% of U.S. companies say that China has become more restrictive in doing business? In addition to regulatory issues, there are the soft kinds of protectionism where favoritism is given to state-owned enterprises by certain kinds of requirements that will only fit a state-owned enterprise or whatever, to give the illusion of an open market, but it's really a protectionism. These companies have no motivation to hurt China and hurt relationships because they're doing business, but yet it has gone up this year to 80% saying that doing business is more difficult in China. Professor Zhang, how should I interpret this statistic?
Yeah, actually, for so many years, China, in order to attract foreign direct investment, offered a special treatment to foreign companies, including many U.S. companies. This is really more than the treatment China gives to its own domestic companies. Now, with the WTO entry, with China reform and opening up, increasingly China adopts this same standards for all companies, Chinese and foreign, so put on the equal footing. So this is a slight change compared with what's happened in the past. Indeed, if China had adopted the U.S. approach on the ground of so-called national security, then you could not have this kind of American companies' pervasive presence in China, in China's IT industry. Everyone uses smartphones, we use Android system, and so many people use iPhones. And so if we use national security ground, then it will be deep trouble for bilateral relations. But on the other hand, really, we return to same national treatment for all.
Dr. Tung, in order to promote globalization, China needs to be seen as a good global and regional citizen. Yet China has issues with many of its neighbors, almost all of its neighbors: Japan, India, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Singapore. Why are there so many of these conflicts? Some of them are bigger than others, but virtually with all of the surrounding countries that border China.
Yeah, you're right. Generally speaking, this is a historic arrangement by the the countries, and the dispute between China and these neighboring countries are there for many decades. But I think some third party, for example, the United States, actually in recent years, especially during Obama's administration, who adopted the so-called rebalanced declaration Pacific region, is actually offshoring strategy used by the countries in Europe for 100 years ago, and they just try to manipulate the dispute between China and these neighboring countries, and for the rebalancing in this region. So I think the territorial dispute, the maritime dispute, and also some other dispute, for example, the trade dispute with our neighboring countries and other dispute, I think should be a very long story for us to understand, and it's not easy for Chinese government to manage these dispute in one day and settle down all the dispute in one day. And we can sit down as something happened between China and the Philippines over the dispute in the South China Sea. And this time, I think China and the Philippines prefer to return to the negotiation table, and that's only way for China and for its neighboring countries to solve all the dispute, related to territory, maritime division, and some other, dispute.
Professor Zhang, President Xi Jinping's vision has made him, according to the world media, the new leader of globalization, the new incarnation of what has been called the Davos man, this great internationalist. Yet there are major differences that you've pointed to between Xi's vision of globalization and the traditional Davos ideal. What are those differences?
It's very different, actually. The Davos man is about the globalization, liberalization, marketization, human rights, democracy defined by the West. And Xi Jinping's globalization is about win-win cooperation between different nations, different countries. And especially, we should be a more inclusive globalization. Poor countries and the vulnerable groups in the society, in the country, should also gain from globalization. And politically, we should respect each other's sovereignty. And China stressed this point very firmly, that each country has right to choose its own way of development, its own political system, economic system, and other systems.
China has more at stake in a globalized world than does any other major country. In other words, China's economy is especially vulnerable to the growing international movement of anti-globalization. In this volatile environment, President Xi offers 4 overarching principles: innovation-driven growth, win-win cooperation, fair and equitable governance, and inclusive development. Good words, but how do they translate into actionable policies and robust economics? Moreover, how can China champion globalization without making certain changes itself? To exemplify leadership, China needs to open more of its domestic markets in practical reality as well as in legal statute. Foreign companies should feel more, not less, welcome doing business in China. We'll be watching as China seeks the opportunities and faces the challenges of globalization in a new world order. That's Closer to China.